The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Good morning, and thank you for being here. I ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions without objection. So ordered. I'd like to welcome everyone to the hearing today on building a 21st century infrastructure for America, water resources, projects, and policy. The Corps of Engineers constructs projects critical to the nation for purposes of navigation, flood control, environmental restoration, shoreline protection, hydroelectric power, recreation, restoration enhancement of fish and wildlife mitigation, and other purposes. Today we'll review 6 U.S. Army Corps of Engineer project chief reports that have been delivered to Congress since the WIN Act, which included the Water Resources Development Act of 2016. Additionally, the Corps of Engineers delivered to Congress the Packer Post-Authorization Change Report on the Savannah Harbor Deepening Project, and had the chance to go out there and go see that project with Congressman Buddy Cotter and the local non-federal sponsors, and an impressive work being done out there, and I think certainly a national, much national importance there. But the 6 chief reports and the 1 post-authorization change report are the result of a pretty robust planning process. These projects are proposed by the non-federal interest in cooperation and consultation with the Corps of Engineers, and all of these reports, while tailored to meet the locally developed needs, must justify national economic and environmental benefits. Since the enactment of the WIN Act, the Corps has also transmitted 2 annual reports on future water resources development as required by Section 7001 of the Water Resources Development Act of 2014. The annual reports identify completed feasibility reports, proposed feasibility reports, and proposed modifications to existing authorized projects or studies for potential future authorization by the Congress, and are based upon annual requests from the non-federal sponsors. Today, we'll also examine the Corps' policy by which these projects are implemented. As you know, our nation's water resource infrastructure is underfunded and in need of updating. Further, our project development and delivery process is outdated and antiquated and needs innovation and efficiency. Our ports struggle to maintain their navigation channels at their full authorized depths, directly impacting our global competitiveness. As we've seen the growth in our economy as a result of tax legislation, the reduction of unemployment in this nation, that puts additional stress on our infrastructure, whether it be our ports, roads, and waterways, or it's on our resilient communities and development. The annual reports identify, excuse me, I jumped. Our ports, it's not just our navigation system that needs to be upgraded, but also our levees and dam systems, so on average, are over 50 years old. Right now, there's a backlog of 1,000 water resource projects authorized by the Congress, totaling nearly $100 billion in need. With an annual appropriation for construction through the Corps of Engineers, somewhere between $1 and $2 billion, it doesn't take a math whiz to recognize that we simply will never complete the authorized projects and never catch up. Therefore, it's critical that the Corps of Engineers work as efficiently as possible. I want to thank you for including in your testimony a discussion of the President's infrastructure legislative principles that are directly applicable to the Civil Works program. And additionally, I look forward to discussing the next steps taken by the Corps, as well as internal efforts to drive efficacy and efficiency at all levels of the organization. I'll say it again, the status quo is simply unacceptable. In the end, we have a lot of work to do in order to ensure that our water resources system can sustain the competitiveness of the American economy and protect our national security. I'll now recognize the ranking member, Ms. Napolitano, for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for holding this important meeting and hearing on the condition of our nation's waterways resources infrastructure. I also want to extend my warm welcome to both the new Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, General James, and the Chief of Engineers here, Mr. Semonite, that we've had conversations before. But today's hearing presents a good opportunity to highlight the stark differences between the Trump administration and the Democratic caucus' better deal on investment in our nation's infrastructure, especially as its water-related infrastructure. These differences were laid bare just 2 weeks ago when the President released both his budget request for the year 2019 as well as the much-hyped infrastructure proposal. Judging from almost universal lukewarm reaction he has received, it is clear the President's priorities on infrastructure are not focused on America's future or ensuring that our citizens, our communities, and our business have access to infrastructure that is second to none in preparation for everything, including commerce. No, it seems that the President's priorities are what they always have seemed to be. How best for the Wall Street friends to profit off American people and leave behind a weaker, more expensive, less sustainable future for our nation. While the President talks big about trillions in investment, it's really just a scam. What little federal money may be actually in this proposal, his proposal, simply comes from robbing other existing infrastructure investment programs, such as $1 billion cut to the construction budget of the Army Corps of Engineers. Further, the fine print of his proposal calls for Americans to dig deeper into their own pockets to pay again and again for essential public services, such as safe and efficient transportation and transit, essentially water and wastewater services, and the critical related water infrastructure projects provided by the Army Corps of Engineers. Over and over again, his plan is out of step for our proud Americans' made infrastructure traditions, calling for new tolls and fees, greater costs, and less decision-making authority for states and local governments, and weakened federal protections. Investing in our infrastructure, including our water-related infrastructure, should be an opportunity to improve the health of our communities, our economy, and financial stability of our American families, not the bottom line of Wall Street investors. It should reward American manufacturers, American farmers, and American workers, not companies seeking to privatize public services and seek to profit on every highway mile traveled, river mile shipped, or a gallon of water consumed by American families. The House Democratic Caucus has such a plan. It's called A Better Deal to Renew America. This bold, comprehensive plan calls for a historic $1 trillion federal investment to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure and create more than 16 million American jobs. The Better Deal will invest in American iron and steel and new American-made green infrastructure materials to support good-paying jobs and ensure opportunities for small business owners. It will ensure projects advance quickly while maintaining key environmental protections and labor standards. Mr. Chairman, like you, I'm excited to begin on a new Water Resources Development Act. Yet this committee has been extremely successful in getting our work done, thanks to Mr. Schuster, and authorizing the next generation of core projects to benefit our communities and our nation. However, I share the frustration of many of our local sponsors when they realize how little work they put into authorizing a core means if the funding to build that project does not easily follow. That is why we need a bold vision on how to make those infrastructure investments and see that the hard work of local sponsors and the Corps become reality. The President's vision shows us a vision that calls for a diminished role for the Corps in meeting our water resources future. A vision that calls for allowing Wall Street buddies to profit off hardworking American families and taxpayers. A vision that calls for increased privatization of public services and cutting and gutting of critical worker and environmental protections. Mr. Chairman, I urge this Congress to reject the President's vision and to work with our side on the aisle to make real substantial investments on our water infrastructure. We stand ready to work on a better infrastructure deal that benefits all Americans. And again, I want to welcome our witnesses here today to bring the discussion and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. I want to thank the ranking member. I also want to remind her that the appropriations requests are in line with those of the previous administration. With that, I yield to the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Schuster, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Napolitano, for having this hearing today. Welcome, Secretary James. I believe this is your first time in front of this committee, so welcome. And General Simonette, good to see you. You've been here a few times before. We appreciate you making the trip up here. You know, this hearing is a critical step in the process to move and develop and then move a water resources bill. And everybody knows that water infrastructure is reliable, efficient water infrastructure is vital to our global competitiveness. So again, I'm pleased that we're on track to pass another WRDA bill. We'll get back on the track that we got off of several years ago to every Congress authorize these projects. Again, it enables Congress to carry out its clear federal role in building the nation's infrastructure. So again, I'm very, very pleased we're on our way to another water resources bill, and I appreciate Ms. Napolitano for thanking me, but it's really the committee working together is how we get these things done. And so I thank everybody on the committee that rolls up their sleeves and we figure out how to move a bill forward. Again, today's part of our transparent process that we established in 2004, again, to make sure that projects and related policies are in place and moving forward for the next bill. Again, as the chairman mentioned, we need to have a more efficient project delivery system in place, and I know that the folks at the Corps have been working hard on it, but we need to do a better job if we are going to build that 21st century infrastructure that we so desperately need to do. So again, thank you, Secretary James, for being here. Welcome, and General, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to yield opening statement time to the ranking member, Mr. DeFazio.
I thank the chairman. I want to welcome Secretary James here, his first appearance for the committee. Obviously, you bring a wealth of knowledge regarding our inland waterways, and we'll also be talking a little bit about some coastal port issues too. But appreciate your being here, and General, you know, thank you again for your service. You know, the exchange between the subcommittee chair and the subcommittee ranking, where the subcommittee chair reminded Ms. Napolitano that the appropriations were basically in sync with the previous administration. Well, I didn't like what the previous administration did. And unfortunately, this administration is continuing the same practice. That is, we are assessing a tax on the American people. Every time you buy an imported good, every single thing you buy, there is a tiny ad valorem tax added to it. And this was a creation of Ronald Reagan, supposedly an icon of the Republican Party. He said, we need stable funding to deal with our port issues. So the tax was established. And unfortunately, yes, the Obama administration underspent the tax for phony baloney purposes in the budget, just as this administration has proposed. Basically, we collect the tax, and part of the money gets diverted into a theoretical trust fund over there somewhere in the Treasury that we never spend. It'll be about $10 billion of diverted taxes if this president's budget is adopted and if we appropriate at these levels. So we're continuing the mistakes of the past. Now, Obama never well, he did pretend that he was going to do infrastructure, went around leaning on a shovel a lot, but he never really did an investment in infrastructure. That's why I oppose his Recovery Act. 4% went to infrastructure, 4% of $800 billion. So let's not continue the mistakes of the past and defend this administration for doing the same boneheaded thing. In fact, the same dishonest thing, which is collecting a tax from the American people to meet, you know, established and unmet needs for our ports and divert the money over into some other program or illusory deficit reduction. It's indefensible. If we're going to collect the, well, I suppose they are a little more honest. They want to reduce the tax, and so then permanently reduce funding for our ports. It's great we do WRDA bills every 2 years, and in the last couple of bills, we've added $40 billion to the unmet, unfunded, authorized backlog of the Corps. So the Corps now has a $96 billion authorized, unfunded pile of projects sitting out there. About half of them are critical projects. The others are, they have different levels of support or need. Our harbors, on a daily basis, our 59 largest ports, are operating somewhere around 40% of authorized depths. We don't have the money to do the dredging. I've got harbors on the south coast of my district, despite the small ports set aside, they're not going to get dredged this year. We don't have the money. We don't have the money. Well, we do have the money. We're just stealing it from the American people and dumping it somewhere else, maybe into the wall with Mexico. I don't know where it's going. But it's time to stop playing this game. In the last word of bill, I offered an amendment out of this committee to have a real trust fund, and it was the only thing taken out of the bill by the Speaker at the behest of now disgraced former Budget Chair Price, who wanted to put the money somewhere else. Let's stop playing this game. We have these needs. We've got to meet them. And I hope the Secretary can help us be an advocate for that. We had one honest guy who lasted a few months in the Bush administration, Mike Parker, and he came in and I said, is this budget adequate to meet the needs of the Corps of Engineers? He said no. The next week, he had to get time with his family and leave his job because he was honest. We need some advocacy. We need to fight for this money, and hopefully this committee will join in that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. DeFazio. How many other people have you caused to lose their jobs?
Whatever it takes.
I said, how many other people have you caused to lose their jobs?
No.
Look, I very quickly.
Get rid of my VA.
I do want to say that, Mr. DeFazio, I appreciate your continuing efforts to bring attention to this issue. I think you know that I agree with you 100% on this, and the problem is not within this committee. If we were to charge fees under the auspices of using it for a particular purpose and then spending it elsewhere in the private sector, that's called embezzling. In the federal government, that's called budgeting, and it's ridiculous. So I certainly share your concerns. Before I begin introducing our witnesses this morning, I also want to dispense with some unanimous consent requests. I ask unanimous consent that the record remain open 15 days for initial comments and information submitted by members or witnesses be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open at such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. Without objection, so ordered. Ask unanimous consent that letters from a whole bunch of different groups, including American Sport Fishing, National Wildlife Federation, Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnerships, and many, many others be submitted for the record. And also, yes, unanimous consent that correspondence from the Audubon be submitted, be included in the record of the hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Thank you, and I want to welcome our newly confirmed Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, Mr. R.D. James, who's with us for the first time today. And we also welcome the Commanding General and Chief of Engineers, Lieutenant General Todd Semonite. Mr. Secretary, I appreciate you being here. You and I have had the opportunity to work together for about 20 years, and we have not always seen eye to eye on issues, but something that I think we do see eye to eye on right now is that we have fundamental changes within the Corps of Engineers that are needed, and in terms of improving the efficiency of project development and delivery, and I look forward to working with you on that. And with that, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Other members of the committee, first I apologize that I didn't get around the dais to meet all of you and say good morning to you, but due to the hour, due to the number of you, I didn't make it around to you. Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Napolitano, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, I'm honored to testify before your committee today along with General Semonite, Chief of Engineers. We will talk on the subject of America's water resources infrastructure. I was recently sworn in as Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, and I look forward to working with this subcommittee in the Congress to address the nation's water resource infrastructure. And let me state at that point that I intend to visit with each one of this committee's members in your office to get a clear understanding of what you think we ought to be doing, and get a feeling for this committee. And I commit to doing that as soon as I can get on your schedules. The President's fiscal year 2019 budget and infrastructure proposal recognizes the current paradigm for investing in water resources development is not sustainable and can deter rather than enable local communities, states, and private sector from making important investments on their own, even when they are primary beneficiaries. The administration's infrastructure proposal and other reforms in the budget are designed to enable local decision-making by the local communities and state governors, since they're the ones who best know what infrastructure investments are needed. The President's infrastructure proposals contain legislative principles that are directly applicable to the Corps Civil Works responsibilities. The 6 principles are designed to remove barriers and expedite the delivery of infrastructure projects, combine new and existing revenue streams to enable greater efficiencies for our nation's inland waterways, encourage innovation by providing incentives in the forms of grants and low-cost loans to non-federal entities, streamline the Corps' Section 404/10 and 408 programs, and authorize federal divestiture of assets that would be better managed by the state or private entities. And I would say to that the Corps has already begun a few months ago its own analysis of its own progress, its own procedures, and how to get more bang for the buck. I will always also say that I have initiated a task force from the Secretary's office that will be looking into the Corps as well as some of the processes of other agencies that may hamper the moving forward of our critical project processes and get more bang for the buck. My office is working with the Corps and other federal agencies to streamline the federal permitting and oversight infrastructure projects through implementation of Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, FAST 41, and through various recently signed executive orders. In addition, we're continuing to work together to identify and implement organizational efficiency opportunities, regulations, and procedures that will improve the Corps' ability to move dirt and get to results. Regardless of where the Corps of Engineers is located, we agree there is need to address internal policies, regulations, processes, and cultural impediments to ensure that the Corps remains relevant into our future. We want to be value-added in addressing the water resource needs of this nation. I look forward to working with each of you and other members of the subcommittee to improve ways that we address the nation's infrastructure needs. Let me say to you, when I took this job, I had 2 things in mind of trying to do, and that was one of those was to quit focusing on the process and get to results. The other was move dirt on the ground. And I want to work with each of you on this committee to try to reach that end. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
I ask unanimous consent that the Assistant Secretary get an additional 2 minutes for his southern drawl. With that, we recognize the Chief of Engineers, General Semonite, for 5 minutes.
Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member DeFazio, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Napolitano, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm glad to have Secretary James on the Civil Works team, and I look forward to working with him in addressing water resource challenges across the nation. I've been in command of the Corps for close to 2 years, and I want to briefly update you on where we are going. As I said last year, the Corps' credibility is measured on our ability to deliver results that are on time, on budget, and of exceptional quality. Since Congress first authorized our navigation mission in 1824, the Corps has worked hard to develop and implement solutions to the nation's water resource challenges. We are able to do this because we have world-class workforce of talented and dedicated professionals who are absolutely passionate about what we do. None of our work can be done alone. It's with the full participation and hard work of many others. We appreciate, value, and depend upon the support of the administration, the Congress, and all of our partners to succeed in our mission. I'm very proud of the work that the Corps accomplishes, but I'm equally aware that this organization can improve. I have been and remain committed to instituting changes to the Corps' delivery process in order to become a more efficient and effective organization. The Corps faces a multitude of challenges, some old and some new. Much of our infrastructure is well beyond the design life, yet the requirements have never been greater. The demands on the federal budget continue to grow, and as our infrastructure ages, we find more and more of our annual appropriation going to operations and maintenance activities at the expense of both investigations and construction investments. Today, we have over $96 billion in construction requirements, representing the federal share of a multitude of projects. We have close to 100 ongoing feasibility studies, which, if authorized, will simply add to the federal budget requirement. Our feasibility studies are formulated with an assumption of efficient funding, and most all are multiple-year projects, but we budget on an annual basis with no assurances that adequate funding will be available from year to year. This creates uncertainty for our non-federal sponsors, drives up project costs, and delays the realization of benefits. At the current rate, it'll take over 100 years to address that backlog, and this is simply unacceptable. Together, we must remove barriers to the development and improvement of our water resource infrastructure. We must encourage and incentivize alternative project financing, streamlining federal procedures, and delivering projects and reduce unnecessarily federal oversight to facilitate timely delivery of projects. The Corps has been working on this issue with the administration and was instrumental in developing 20 legislative proposals. They're in my hand right here that we think should be part of the President's infrastructure package. The Corps continues to work on policy and administrative changes that can improve infrastructure delivery. Over the last year, I've assembled my general officers, my senior executives, my colonels, and my senior leaders to look internally at our organization, our authorities, our policies, regulations, and procedures in order to identify opportunities for increased efficiency and effectiveness. The Corps is fully engaged in support of 5 administrative efforts aimed at streamlining our regulatory processes. The Corps is addressing topics such as implementing the one federal decision that establishes discipline and accountability in the environmental review and permitting process for infrastructure projects. We're also reviewing the nationwide permit program to identify modifications that will increase the efficiency of decision-making. And we continue working with the EPA as we review the 2015 Waters of the United States rule. Our goal is to simplify the process for gaining infrastructure permits while protecting the environment in accordance with the law. We are working to delegate more decisions to the lowest appropriate level and encouraging our leadership to take more prudent risk. An example are the multiple improvements the Corps is implementing in our Section 408 review process. Our technical experts close to the issues can make decisions based on their experience, knowledge, and competence in a specific area. To put this concept to practice, we're seeking to make 408 decisions at the lowest possible level, eliminate redundancies, identify alternative processes or authorities, and clarify when such permissions aren't even required. We believe that risk-informed or professional judgment decisions should be made and documented without being subject to numerous time-consuming reviews. We're looking at how we can best capture the total value of our projects. Most communities have a master plan that was developed based on an analysis to determine best value for the community or region. This may consider facts like life risk reductions, economic value, and resiliency of the community. We want to make sure that our reports reflect the total value of our projects so that we may enhance opportunities for non-federal investment. We're reviewing existing authorities that allow sponsors to take ownership of the project delivery process and may help leverage non-federal financing, such as Section 203 and 204 authorities provided to WRDA in 1986. The Corps wants to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. We recognize the need to address internal policies, regulations, processes, and cultural impediments in order to remain relevant into the future. We want to be value-added, to deliver solutions, whatever role we may have in that endeavor. But we can't do all these reforms in isolation. We need the help of OMB and Congress to unleash the power of the Corps by acting on our numerous recommendations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. This concludes my testimony, and I look forward to answering questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, General. We're going to go ahead and go to questions. I appreciate the testimony from both of you. We're going to start with a gentleman from Ohio and the author of the WRDA 14 and 16 bills, Mr. Gibbs.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. Great to see you, General, and Honorable James. First question, many stakeholders have shared concerns with me about the inconsistency in the application to the 2008 mitigation rule, which has resulted in uncertainty and confusion in the 404 permitting. This, in turn, has resulted in significant costs and delays in the Clean Water Act permitting. My question is, do you plan to exercise your oversight and authority with more predictability, such as issuing a national guidance with respect to the provisions in the rule that have been applied in certain districts in a manner that has led to the undue costs and delays? I guess either one of you can try to answer that.
I'm sorry, sir. I thought you were talking to the general.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, the question is the 2008 mitigation rule in regard to 404 permitting. The shareholders, it's about uncertainty and confusion, and I think you can exercise oversight authority and bring more predictability to that by issuing a national guidance. Go ahead, General.
So as I said, sir, we are looking at all of those permitting issues. Again, a lot of it goes back to, I think, over the years, some things have migrated to a higher level. So we've got to be able to delegate it back down to the level of where there's competence and capacity, both of those, to be able to streamline. The challenge you have sometimes is when you delegate back down, especially when you have 43 districts, sir, then it's closer to the decision, but sometimes there is areas where somebody might make different decisions. So we have a process where we really have a lead district to be able to make sure we're as consistent as possible. We are trying to put more information back out so that the adherence back into those policies can build consistency back in. I think it's something we want to do, but I think what we don't want to do is overly centralize. If you centralize, then what happens is there's obviously...
I agree with that, General, but we want to make sure we don't have a similar situation in one district and then doing the opposite in another district, and that just drives people crazy.
And the best thing, sir, we can do is when we identify those issues, we bring the players together, but we also have to learn, and then we have to get that word back out so that everybody gets to be able to apply that the same way.
Okay, thank you. My next question, talking to SULOC stakeholders informed us that the Corps is including in a new benefit cost ratio calculation for the SULOC project only at $2 billion the cost to build an alternative rail system to transport iron ore if this pole lock outage, if there's a significant outage at the pole lock. I also understand that the Corps' own contractor estimated the cost to actually build a rail connection would be closer to $6.5 billion. Why isn't the Corps including the entire cost of the construction of the rail capacity plus the rail operating costs for an average lock outage in the SULOC project in their economic review?
So I've been to SULOC a couple months ago, sir. I think, and I'm looking at this right now, we ran a series of failures on the SULOCs. We did about 10,000 runs of a risk failure. About 50% of those runs would require the rail. So that's where, right now, the way that the formula is doing is we're only apportioning 50% of the cost. But that doesn't really make a lot of sense. You can't build 50% of a railroad. So I think as we go back in there, we want to be able to make sure that we're giving all these projects the absolute best chance of success. So when you get to make a decision, you're able to figure out where best to put that money. So I think it's something that, even myself, I'm asking, is that the right way to do it? And if we don't have the authority to be able to make that when we come to that analysis, then I want to come back and make sure we're using common sense and maybe get the appropriate guidance to have that authority.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because I mean, you got to be fair on these benefit cost ratio. And if you skew the input, you're going to get a skewed output, right? And I think you mentioned that, and I think it, there's other things to probably go through there besides iron ore.
Mr. Congressman, if I may.
Yes, go ahead.
The SULOCs is very high on my priority list, and the main reason is, as I understand it, and I did not know this before I got up here 4 weeks ago, is that all the iron ore in this country come out through that SULOC system and through the existing pole lock, I think it's called. I do not think we have rail capacity in that part of the country to get iron ore out of there. I think iron ore is critical to the national defense of this country, to the automobile as well as other industries, and to homeland security. So the benefit cost ratios that we have been looking at historically, I'm going to look into trying to change the parameters of the benefits and try to move this project forward. Of course, as you know, we're looking at both the repair and extreme updating of the existing one, plus the capability of a new one. So I will have that on my priority list.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because I've been pushing for this since I've been in Congress. I'm starting my 8th year, and it's just been frustrating. It needs to get done. It's a national economic importance for national security, as you say. And your predecessor, when I was chairman of this committee, I challenged her a little bit because she said they had to do this cost-benefit ratio. And I said to her, I think, Ms. Secretary, we could sit here in the next 15 minutes and do it, because this is a no-brainer. And so I'm glad to hear that. That's refreshing.
Mr. Gibbs, your clock actually got reset during the thing, so I think we're actually at in excess of 5 minutes right now.
Oh, okay.
But it literally just reset in the middle, so I apologize.
All right, I yield back then.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to...
I thought the clock was acting funny, but I didn't want to mention it.
I was trying to figure out what button you pressed to do that. I'm going to yield 5 minutes,
Mr. Chairman, I think the general reset it.
Mr. Chairman, there seems to be an emerging discussion on the merits of keeping civil works function within the Department of the Army. I and other members of this committee believe the Corps should retain its civil works mission, not only because of historic expertise in managing and balancing our nation's water resources challenges, but also because this civil mission complements our national security, as was pointed out, and our military readiness. As you know, protecting our navigation corridors, especially during times of military conflict, is critical to our national security, as is ensuring the health and safety of our citizens, our communities, from flooding and coastal storms. General Semonite, I would appreciate your views on the potential consequences of removing this function from DOT and potentially breaking up various core missions among other federal or state agencies. In your view, is there an ongoing reason for retaining this mission within DOD?
Ma'am, thanks for that question. I think it probably involves a lot more than a couple-minute an answer here. I think the biggest question is, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And let's make sure we understand what's the end state we're trying to get to, and then how somehow do we address that. I think your very key point there was national security. The other thing is the Corps of Engineers works for many, many different capabilities in the federal government. Those capabilities are resonant in all of our different engineering capabilities. The service we provide, one of those is civil works. Right now, though, we put 13,000 volunteers in Iraq and Afghanistan for national security to do critical missions for the Department of Defense. We put 4,000 people in Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Texas, and Florida in the last 6 months to take care of being FEMA's engineer. So while you think you could cut civil works out, the rest of the depth of the Corps, which is really the engineering and construction capability, is so much more powerful back to the nation. And I'd love to have more discussions, but I know in the interest of time, I'm just going to keep it very, very short.
Thank you for the answer. Mr. James and Lieutenant General Semonite, my local water agencies, the Water Replenishment District of Southern California and the LA County Department of Public Works have been working with the Corps over 12 years on providing interim deviations and permanent deviation for additional water supply at Whittier Narrows. This is a big success and a great failure. We're still waiting. The great failure is that the local agencies have spent 12 years and $5 million of their own money working with the Corps on a permanent deviation. My water agencies can no longer contribute their time and their money to a never-ending and excessively bureaucratic process. They feel the Corps should have implemented it 12 years ago, but delayed because of post-Katrina, which is fair. Then that produced effective water supply measures at dry dams when our drought-prone region most needed it. Now the project is delayed further, and costs have risen due to the new dam safety work at that dam. And a recent U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service determination that millions of dollars in mitigation funds are needed for gnats, little old gnats. This all would have been avoided if the Corps had been committed to the project 12 years ago. Can you commit to us that when local water agencies are offering to give Corps money, like WRD, to work on projects that will address local needs, the Corps will work expeditiously on these projects?
So, ma'am, let me answer. We are very, very committed to continue to look at where we can find more capability for water supply. You and I have talked about this. I've been to California. We're doing this on other dams right now. We are committed to continue to look at Whittier Narrows. The problem is that's a DSAC 1 dam. So we will have our analysis done by June 19th on how we're going to fix that dam. Once we do that, we then want to look at how can we put more water in the dam, but right now we're focused on the safety of the dam, but we're continued to be able to get that dam hopefully fixed with the congressional funding by 2022.
Is that a promise, a timeline?
Ma'am, it's obviously dependent on budget, if the money comes.
Again, the budget. Well, Section 1304 of the WIN Act directed the Corps to integrate and incorporate into the Corps dams in LA County seasonable operation for water conservation and water supply. What is the Corps doing to implement this provision and allow for more water supply and recharge opportunities at these dams?
So that will be mixed back in with that study. We're doing both concurrently, where we could continue to fix the dam, but then we've got to be able to look at where's the safe zone, how much water supply can we keep in there, so we still have the flood control piece. That's the big balance there. And we have seen areas where sometimes local people want to have more and more water in, but then all of a sudden you have a microburst on top of that flood control area, and you don't have enough capacity.
Well, we hope we have more water. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We can go to Mr. Weber for Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. This, Mr. Hicks, I'm sorry. This is from Fred Hicks, Gulf Coast Water Authority, and this is about Lake Whitney in Texas, which is north of our district a little bit. And this is actually for both of you, Mr. James and Lieutenant General Semonite. My constituents at the Gulf Coast Water Authority are responsible for providing water supply for a number of municipalities, industrial plants, agricultural irrigation from my district, and those of actually several other members of Congress. This water supply comes from the Brazos River and from Lake Whitney, which is a core reservoir. The Gulf Coast Water Authority is currently working with the Army Corps to address a reallocation of some of the waters from Lake Whitney to better serve the 21st century needs of our greater Houston region, of course, the area that I represent, as well as some of the other members of Congress. This would be through the Corps' O&M budget and with 100% of the necessary funding provided by the Gulf Coast Water Authority. Now, we just went through one heck of a flood with Harvey, and so we had more water than we knew what to do with. But there will come times we'll have a drought, and we need to be able to reallocate some of that water from Lake Whitney, which has not been used to date. So I guess the questions for the both of you is, can we look forward to y'all's cooperation and participation working with the Gulf Coast Water Authority? And then who should we contact in your office to get this set up and get this ball rolling? Mr. James, I'll start with you.
Yes, sir. I can say that water supply is a growing concern in the entire country due to the heavy population concentrations. You know, our population as a nation may not be growing, but they're concentrating in certain areas. That makes water supply very important. We have to balance that with the other authorized uses of a federal project, but one of them being flood control. And we have to look at those as individuals. I will tell you that I think that the General will back this up, that we will be looking at this as we move forward, the area that you're talking about in Texas.
Okay, you're probably not, I know there's hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of these, so you're probably not specifically, knowledgeable about this one. In general, you may not be either. But I needed the name of somebody in your office that we can get this ball rolling.
So, sir, Colonel Zetterstrom talked to you a couple of weeks ago. There's 4 different issues you're tracking, so we're aware of this.
Okay.
Especially when the funding is coming from somebody else. That really is able to take that burden back off the federal government. So
much for budget problems, as the ranking member pointed out.
Zetterstrom's the guy. I talked to him.
Okay.
He sent me a note last night, and I'll make sure I follow up and tell him to come see you.
Fair enough. I need to move on to actually a more sticky subject, and that is there's a critical and deleterious issue in my district harkening back to a Clinton area initiative referred to as the Columbia Bottomlands. Columbia Bottomlands. And what that is, which was actually killed back then by then Senator Phil Gramm and Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison. Well, the Obama administration tried to revive it and snuck in an 11th hour rule, making it the record before President Trump took office, and the subject matter, nationwide permit reissuance, all right? NPRs, I guess you call them, was apparently announced by the Corps on January the 6th, 2017, in the Federal Register, announcing the reissuance of all 50 existing nationwide permits, NWPs, general conditions and definitions with some modifications, done with little fanfare, little public notice, very short comment period, as I recall, with virtually no transparency in the process. To this day, most of my constituents don't even realize in Brazoria County that they've been the victims of, quote, property taking, end quote. The following went into effect on March 19th, 2017, and I'll quote this. For the purpose of this regional condition, Columbia bottomlands are defined as waters of the United States. Sound familiar? That are dominated by bottomland hardwoods in the lower Brazos and San Bernard River regions, end quote. Totally unacceptable. Short of working with my Appropriations Committee colleagues to absolutely defund this property taking by the Corps, I'm hopeful that we can revisit this matter. Again, somebody in your office that we can interface with so that we can actually get this reversed, because this is totally unacceptable.
Sir, right now, I think the Corps has out for review, and this is the one that's out for review that's due in right away within the next month or two. I have marked it in my office to review whatever the Corps comes up with on this ruling as we move forward, not only in your area, but the rest of the United States. That WOTUS rule has been overexpanded, it's been overinterpreted, and I'm going to look at that, and if I have the power to do anything about the WOTUS rule as it exists.
Let me interrupt, if I can, Mr. Chairman, with your indulgence. I have a developer that wants to go in there and put 250-something homes in this area. And that developer is held up by this taking right here. So time is of the essence. Mr. Semonite, can I jump to you real quick? Who do we work with?
Please, quickly, and let's finish up.
Sir, this is definitely tied up in the WOTUS rework that we're doing with EPA. So this is a big issue. We will work it as a team and keep you informed.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We're going to go to the ranking member, Mr. DeFazio.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. General, the estimates I have from the Corps are to achieve and maintain constructed width steps of all federal navigation projects is about $20.3 billion over the next decade. Do you have anything to contradict that? Or, I mean, that's a recent estimate we have.
Sir, I'm not exactly aware of that number, but I think that's probably in a ballpark.
Okay. So as we discussed earlier, since we're going to divert or perhaps even reduce the tax that goes to harbor maintenance, the projected budget is a little less than $10 billion. So is there a 50% increase in efficiency in dredging and maintaining jetties that you can conceive, unless we're to maybe commission, the Chinese to come in and use illegal immigrant labor or something? How are we going to double our efficiency and achieve those depths and get to that point with that money?
So, sir, I'm not prepared to answer the actual double you're talking about. I know that you're very concerned about jetties. We are doing a study, and we're going to have that study done in about 4 months, and that should lay out some of those answers. I've not seen the analysis yet, but we want to come back to you, and if nothing else, we'll brief you on exactly where we're at with the jetty analysis.
Okay, I appreciate that. Mr. Secretary, I mean, I know you've only been there 4 weeks, and some of this preceded you, but again, if you look at these numbers, the estimates are if we fully spent the collected tax and didn't reduce the tax, for the next 5 years, if we spent $2.5 billion a year on maintenance, dredging, and jetty work on all our federal projects, and then 1.6 to 1.7 over the next 5 years, we could get to authorized depths and be at a state of good repair. How are we going to do that with half of that money? That's essentially the same question I put to the general, but you talked a little bit about reforms. I mean, I've been here long enough. We used to have federal dredges. We did studies that showed, in fact, they were more efficient and less expensive than the private dredging companies, but because of political influence, particularly a very powerful senator from down in that southern area, we pretty much did away with most of the federal dredges. We have some in reserve, and I've still got them operating in the Northwest. So how are we going to, deal with that $20 billion need over the next 10 years with half the money?
Sir, I apologize, but I can't answer.
I know, you've been there 4 weeks. Anyway, I'm just putting that to you. If you'll think about that, I'd love to chat.
I will think about it, and I'll be glad to visit you personally on it.
Great. Here's something else that I know you won't know, but I just want to put this to you because I've been trying to get the information. This is a regional issue. Columbia River, we have a treaty that has, expired. We're in the beginning of renegotiation with Canada. And one of the most critical aspects of that is flood control. And I'm trying to find out if the Corps has completed, and maybe the General knows, or maybe either of you probably don't know, but if you could get it to me, have you completed the modeling of that system? Because it's a critical aspect as we enter into negotiations to know what we need in terms of flood control. The whole system has changed so much with all the Canadian dams, over the last 50 years that we don't have current data, and our negotiators don't have it at the table. So, and we have to know and plug in flood risk management into this negotiation. General, do you have any knowledge?
I don't know the exact answer on the modeling. I'll get that back to you. But we are very, very aggressively working on everything involved with the treaty. But also we have an EIS we've got to do for the operating system. So all of that is pretty much wrapped up both in what are the capabilities there. There's a lot of environmental issues. There's a lot of navigation issues. But that modeling is critical to be able to make sure it can inform both the Columbia Treaty as well as the EIS.
Yeah, well, the EIS, unfortunately, is due to a overly aggressive federal judge who basically adopted the arguments of the plaintiffs and said this is science when it isn't. And so I understand you've been given, I think it's our 4th time around on this, and we even had marine fisheries. And, we had all the federal agencies were agreeing that this was good, but you're stuck with that. But I think the analysis of flood risk is separate, and if the modeling's done, we need to know what the results are, and we need to get that to our negotiators. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. DeFazio. We're going to Mr. Mast for 5 minutes. Gentleman from Florida and Vice Chair of the Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, no question, the Corps has an excessive amount of authorized water infrastructure projects by Congress. You all, the Corps, you have the technical expertise to complete these projects. Oftentimes, the state has allocated their cost share of those expenses, yet there still remains billions of dollars of backlog of projects. And what I'm wondering is another piece of this, that arbitrary quota that gets put on the new starts that can exist out there, limits the Army Corps to a select number of new starts each year. Can you speak to, does that policy, that new start policy, does that delay the Army Corps from completing some of the water infrastructure projects out there? Is that something we need to look at for reform for you?
I think just from our approach, sir, clearly it's a relatively minor investment to be able to do a study to inform Congress of where can the money be put to the best place. So if, in fact, there is an arbitrary limit that's put on us on studies, then, of course, we can't do that degree of analysis. So I think that, in honesty, I do think there's limiting our capability to be able to inform Congress of where best to put to work. On the other hand, there's probably got to be some degree of guidance. You can't do too many studies because then we're just going to continue to keep adding. So there's probably a sweet spot somewhere, and I'll let the Secretary or, the administration figure out where that is.
So let's jump to that a little bit, those feasibility studies. The readiness of the Corps to conduct these feasibility studies, to begin construction projects, oftentimes you have to wait for an appropriations cycle to move to the next phase of what's going on there. I was listening to your testimony from yesterday, and you literally said, our feasibility studies, they're formulated with the assumption of efficient funding. Most of all are multi-year projects, yet we are budgeted on an annual basis with no assurances that adequate funding will be available from year to year. This creates uncertainty for our non-federal sponsors. It drives up costs and it delays the realization of benefits. And what I'm wondering is there's some reform that can go on in that area, maybe something in terms of development of some sort of revolving fund where the Corps isn't subject to the fiscal year constraints. It gives you a little bit more flexibility to advance to the next phase of project completion without having to wait for that year over year.
I think there's room in almost all of our processes to be able to find ways to streamline and to give us more flexibility. Most of our money is allowed to carry over into another year, and we try to budget efficiently. So I don't have a problem with end of year having to necessarily obligate. But I do think where we really have challenges a lot of times is when we have a construction project where we get ready to go through something, and every single year it has to be revalidated. So that causes us to have a lot of confusion in the contractor base and the stakeholder base. So I think there's a lot of room, and this is what Chairman Graves said, there's a lot of things that we can do to try to somehow, how do you streamline some of these processes that have been too bureaucratic?
And that's what we want to get to, right? Cheaper, faster, but more efficient, and a great product that you produce. So I thank you for your time. Thank you for answering these questions. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. So now we're going to go to Gentlewoman Ms. Franco for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. So maybe a couple of years ago, I sat in on one of these civil works review boards, which I guess we don't have anymore, but it took like a full day, and there were like maybe, I don't know, there were a lot of people around the table. But one of the things that I realized in listening to all the discussion and the different steps was that a lot of the requirements of the steps were based on laws that Congress had passed and requirements. So I wanted to just ask you, I think one of you testified about impediments to the process, the authorization process. I'd like you to tell me specifically what you see as impediments that have been created by the Congress, because that's where we could probably help out.
The chief may speak to this further, ma'am, but as far as I'm concerned, there are some. It's not our place or our position to determine which ones are impediments and which ones are still good legislation. But when you go through the entire process that the Corps has to do on a continuing basis, either on a project or future policy, there is legislation as well as our own internal policies that affect that. I'd be more than happy to talk to you about any of the individual legislation you may be talking about, or in general. I'll be happy to talk to you personally.
Well, no, I'm not myself. I'm not talking. I'm asking you because we may have the ability to change. You know, you keep talking about changing your processes, and I'm asking you, how does Congress impede your process?
Well, ma'am, I think you'd have to, you would have to point to specific legislative pieces in order to point that out to you.
Maybe the general can answer that question.
So, ma'am, I mentioned this in my testimony, and I think I'm not sure that any one of those actions was ever specifically to try to slow down, but the cumulative effect of all of those processes has had a significant impact. And I talked about the 20 things that we've worked. They're right here on the spreadsheet. We have worked very closely with the administration to say, here's some ways that we could continue to be able to make sure we're protecting the environment, we're taking care of water resources, but it allows us to streamline. Things like acquisition, long-term contracts. How do we go down through the budgeting process? How can we work through OMB and continue to be able to streamline the processes in OMB? So that's what we want to offer back to you, is to say, help us find ways of helping ourselves.
So, will that require legislative changes?
I think some are, but the vast majority of them are policies. They're things that we can change by changing rules or regulations, but not necessarily law.
Okay. Well, that's why I'm just asking you if you thought we needed to change any of the laws. Okay, I have another. My timer's not working, so I'm just okay. So I have another question for you. And this is Mr. Schuster's favorite issue. Yes, the sand. It's the sand. We're running out of sand we've run out of sand in Broward and Dade County. It's gone. So, and sand is very important, obviously for tourism, but also to protect the shoreline and so forth. So, for them to get, I'm going to give you an example. A recent Miami-Dade trucking contract was $8.6 million for 140,000 cubic yards of sand. Now, they could buy sand, foreign sand, at about 50% less. Now, for the Congress, $8.6 million is considered chump change, but not for local governments. And I just gave you one example. So I tried to change the law. We did in this committee. We changed the law that would make it easier to buy the sand from the Bahamas. Incidentally, the sand goes south. I think the sand from Miami went to the Bahamas anyway, so we're just trying to get it back. But what happened is along the way, I'm sure, I'm just guessing, but I know Mr. Schuster could probably verify this, the truckers got involved in the process because the language changed and turned what had been language in our bill into a study. Now, I don't think the study's been done. Has the study been done? I mean, it's a stupid study. I don't know why we have to do the study. I'm just curious, though, did we do this stupid study?
Ma'am, I'm not tracking a study on sand in those two counties. The challenge we have, and this is a national issue, is we continue to spend an awful lot of money on beach renourishment. And we're having that same challenge in other places. So the question is, are there innovative ways that we can try to retain that sand so that if nothing else, we can dredge it from just where it's moving back on? Most of the stuff we do on the East Coast is dredging that sand back on the beach. Okay,
no, but that's a different issue. I appreciate that issue, but that's not the issue. The issue is there's language that says that says if materials are not available from domestic sources for environmental or economic reasons, these local governments can't buy sand, for example, from the Bahamas. And so they're forced to buy sand from the middle of the state in Florida and costs them twice as much, all right? So that's the issue. That's a separate issue until you invent the way to keep the sand on the beaches. They need the sand.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. General, if you could please provide answer to the committee in writing, that would be great. Thank you. I turn to the full committee chairman, Mr. Schuster, for 5 minutes.
I'm aware of the lady's problem with sand. The study is ongoing, and the ruling is, and you pointed out there, if it's not available, that they can buy foreign sand. But you know, when I go to the beach, sometimes I get sand in my shoe or other places, and just we got to solve this eventually because Mrs. Frankel is she can take it to me. No, I'm not. My question is not about sand, but it's about the Upper Ohio. The Upper Ohio, I believe the OMB recommended the project be looked at again for additional economic analysis, even though the first study said it's the first time I think I've ever seen the government say restudy this because there's more economic benefit than you've already pointed out. So again, usually it's not enough economic benefit. So anyways, the $5.5 million I think you folks put forth to do the study, can you let me know how's it going? What's the timeline? Are you encountering any kind of problems that we may be able to help you in legislation as you move forward?
Chairman, no issues. We were going to do it in 3 years. We're doing it in 2. We took a year off of it.
That's
we
great.
have enough money to be able to complete it. It'll be done by summer of 19.
Okay, that's great to hear. Great news. Second question is concerning the Raystown Lake. In the 2016 word, we directed the Corps to update its master plan, to look at alternatives for recreation, to look for the development possibilities. Do we need to have all that land that we have there that it could be developed in a county that's a very low-income county? The lake is a great benefit to them, but it would be a tremendous benefit if they could develop, not on the water. I don't want that. I don't think anybody wants that. But you know, you got a mountain that's 1,000 feet or so rising above that. If you were allowed to build along that ridgeline, it would be a tremendous economic positive impact. And I know that, funny how things work around here, that the only core lake that I've seen development occur on is in South Dakota, and that's because Senator Daschle put it in some water bill years ago that they could do that. So if it's good enough for South Dakota, it's good enough for central Pennsylvania. So can you let me know where that master plan is and how it's proceeding?
So, Chairman, we're on plan to keep working this. We got money in the 18 budget, about $600,000. We want to continue to be able to get it up and done. And I don't have an exact date on when it's going to finish, but I'll get that back to your staff. I think the other thing, though, is we're supposed to do these every 10 years. And sometimes we don't have the funds to be able to keep up with that. If we're able to do that in a more routine manner, then we don't need so much time to be able to get this. I think this one's like 25 years old up in Huntington County. So we need to try to figure out how to get this thing up. Right. But we are committed to get this study done as fast as we possibly can.
Okay. Thank you very much. I yield back.
We're going to go to the gentleman from California, Mr. Lowenthal, for gosh,
yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief in my comment. Not like some members. General Salmon and Mr. James, I want to follow up on some of the comments and echo some of the comments of Ranking Member DeFazio when he began to talk about the harbor maintenance fee. And, you know, the President prides himself on as a builder. And you know our country has tremendous needs for infrastructure improvements, especially in our harbors and waterways. Our ports are the center of the 21st century global supply chain. They enable American manufacturers to reach foreign markets and to facilitate the movement of consumer goods and industrial imports throughout our nation. They're a vital national asset, but they face new challenges with larger ships, rising container volume, more congestion, both at the gateways and on land. So in looking at the President's budget and the President's infrastructure proposal, it seems like the administration is trying to cast aside the federal responsibility for these assets, cutting investments in the improvements that we need to make to grow commerce at our seaports. You know, last week we held a hearing on revenue options for surface transportation. However, I'd like to point out in our harbors we have the revenue, yet the administration doesn't propose to spend it or to use it. Can you tell me what's the administration's vision for our ports? How do they propose that we meet these challenges of congestion, growth, international trade by not allocating the resources? Can you tell me?
No, sir, I cannot. But I will be glad to meet with you later with staff, and we'll discuss this. Unfortunately, I don't know enough about our ports yet to discuss them intelligently, and I don't want to give you some kind of off-the-cuff answer.
I just to refresh, and I'm not sure I know the exact numbers. You know that our the harbor maintenance fee, which is really a user fee, or a harbor maintenance tax, which is a user, generates, I think, over $1.6 billion. It goes into a trust fund. The President's only proposing to spend $900 million of that. We have tremendous needs. We're generating for both dredging and for harbor maintenance. That's what the money is supposed to be used for, and yet I don't understand what the President's vision is, where we're going on that. So I would appreciate meeting with you and understanding that more. I think it's vitally important because the revenue stream is there. We're not talking about surface transportation where there is no longer a revenue stream. The same issue is on the Inland Waterways Fund. I would love to have a response back about what's the vision for the use of the inland waterway.
Yes, sir, certainly.
I think that'd be appropriate, and I really look forward to our meeting. Mr. Chairman, I want to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the executive summary of an Army Corps Civil Works report called the Ohio River Basin, Formulating Climate Change Mitigation Adaptation Strategies through Regional Collaboration with the Ohio River Basin Alliance. I'm the co-chair of the Safe Climate Caucus, and I often talk to my community about how we're going to have to adapt to sea level rise and other effects of climate change. General Salmonite, I was struck by how this report detailed the substantial effects we expect from climate change in America's heartland along the Ohio River Basin, from higher stream flows in the spring to longer, drier droughts in the summer and fall. It seems that these challenges will require substantial investments in the resiliency of our inland waterways, and which gets back to that fund. How is the Corps working to meet these challenges from climate change?
I think, sir, the main thing is when we look at a project, we've got to be able to predict what is going to be those future conditions. We can't design for today. We've got to be able to make sure we're designing for about 50 years out, and then we've got to build them back in. So how do we take the effects of weather? How do we take all the things you're talking about? And
climate change specifically, yes.
how do we make sure those things are wrapped into a future project and formulated? And then how do you do that in an affordable manner?
So you build resiliency in when knowing that that's really going to be the issue.
We always look at an alternative of a bunch of different options, and then based on the what is the best return back to the taxpayer, then we pick the best alternative.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Could the gentleman please clarify the author of the summary from the report he wanted in the unanimous consent agreement?
The author is it's the Army Corps' Civil Works.
Okay, so it's their executive summary.
It's their executive summary.
Without objection, the report is
Yes.
included in the record of the hearing. Thank you. We're now going to should we shorten this time? You go to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
I speak with a slow accent too. Can I get some extra time?
We usually just say that you're slow, but please.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And RD, it's great to see you here. Looking forward to working with you. We've worked together in the past, and I know you're going to do a great job here. But as you know, I always have some issues that I bring up with the Corps of Engineers, and it wouldn't be a first hearing for you here without me bringing up NESP.
We've got to get in.
I think it's unacceptable that the Corps has taken a position to do another study before even we can get to pre-construction engineering design. This project, NESP, has been studied, I believe, more than any other Corps project in your agency's history. And to do another economic analysis for PED to move forward, I think is something that needs to be rethought. I want to remind the committee, too, that this was a position that the previous administration took after Congress has already spent nearly $60 million on pre-construction engineering and design. We have strong bipartisan support for this, RD, for NESP, and moving the program forward. So can you commit today to work with me and my colleagues to get the pre-construction engineering design back on track as soon as possible so that we can get these critical navigation ecosystem restoration projects to actual construction?
Yes, sir. I will work with you on that, and I'd like to know your current thinking as well as other members that are concerned about NESP. My concern about NESP is that the environmental concerns nor the navigation's concerns can go anywhere until we are funded to the spot that they can both go together. And I think that's the way that was authorized. It's been a problem since the very beginning. At one point, the environmental part of it could move and the other couldn't. At another point, the navigation part can move, the environmental can't. It almost looks like it was put together that way. I don't know, but I'd like to visit with you, and if you have any more people interested in that we could get together on, I'd be happy to do that. Now, the general may shed some light on where we are right now, but I'd like to look at that too. Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Thank you.
I'll just keep it short, sir. Bottom line, you know this well, 37 locks. These are all about 70 to 80 years old, 1,200 miles of river. If we don't do something soon, I mean, we can't keep putting Band-Aids on these.
That's exactly why I made this point. To do an economic analysis once again, I think is just overkill, and we've got to move on. Another issue that I know we're going to work together on, Mr. James, is on Asian carp, Brandon Road. I'm working with my colleague, Mr. Mitchell, to find ways to make sure that we continue to reduce the Asian carp population in the Mississippi and Illinois waterways. I have a concern, though, that the Corps may be rushing toward an authorization of authorizing a project for $250 million that actually may be a solution in search of a problem. I had our Illinois Department of Natural Resources Director, Wayne Rosenthal, here in D.C. last week, and he reminded me that since 2012, the state has reduced Asian carp population in the Dresden Pool below the Brandon Road lock by 93% already. So what we're doing seems to be working. And further, it's the conclusion of the Department of Natural Resources in the state of Illinois that based on 28 years of scientific monitoring data, there's no indication that the Asian carp population front will move from its current population and its current position. This is evidence to me that we're currently doing something that's working. That's one of the reasons why I'm supportive of the GLRI funding, which the department uses for these population reduction efforts. Specifically, Mr. James, I'm concerned that following the Corps' release of the tentatively selected plan, an entity outside the state of Illinois could be chosen as a non-federal partner for this project. And unfortunately, this is a possibility has apparently been alluded to by leadership at your Chicago district office. Does the Corps have the authority to name a non-federal partner within the state of Illinois, when the project is completely within the state of Illinois, that wouldn't be the state of Illinois?
I visited with the Lieutenant Governor maybe a week or 10 days ago about this very issue. You know, I can't answer that, Mr. Davis. I think that's an issue that the state holds the trump card on. I have also met with some of the other adjoining states that are really pushing for this, and I wish I could give you a yes or no. General Semonite may have a differing opinion than me, but I don't think we can recognize a sponsor of a federal project outside of a state boundary, and that's including the earth under the water.
And I would concur. Our analysis is that unless the state wants to be able to share with someone else, there's no authority we have to force an external player to come into a state.
Well, I appreciate you working with me and my colleagues like Mr. Mitchell. We all have the same goal. We just want to make sure we do it in a way that addresses Illinois' concerns. Thank you, and I don't have any time to yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I think we've heard enough. I'm going to go to the, I want to thank the gentleman from Illinois. We're going to go to the gentleman from California, the ranking member of the Coast Guard Subcommittee, Mr. Garamendi, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Secretary James, welcome. Look forward to working with you. You've got a big job out ahead of you, and it'll be a pleasure. I represent the Sacramento Valley, California, 200 miles of the Sacramento River. General Semonite, thank you so very much for coming to Beale Air Force Base. It was a pleasure meeting you and working with you there, and look forward to your good work out ahead. Like most members, I've got my own projects. I'm going to go through them very quickly. I know that you're aware of them. Marysville, a city in my district, there's $35 million in the budget. We appreciate that. There may be more. We can finish this entire project. It's been all on board. The Sutter Basin, this is the Feather River, the west side of the Feather River, a 40-mile project. There's about 5 miles left to do. We can get it all done. It's ready to go. It does need a new start designation, but it's been underway for a long time. And the city of Woodland, the Lower Cache Creek feasibility study, it was on. It went off because of some local issues. It's now we want to move it forward. We appreciate your attention to that. Hamilton City, another project almost completed, making process on that $6 million. And then we get down to the really interesting questions. You've heard from all of us, we've got our projects, we need our money. Keep in mind that in the infinite wisdom of this legislature, Congress, and the President, we ripped $1.6 trillion out of the federal treasury over the next 10 years. So you want to know where the money is? It's gone. And so when we holler and scream about the Harbor Maintenance Fund and why it's being ripped off to be used for other things, well, there's the reason. There's a huge hole in the Treasury that is being filled by the Harbor Maintenance Fund and by the Inland Waterways Fund, both of which are being ripped off to backfill the hole that we created in our wisdom or lack thereof. And so we're going to scream and yell about money, but it's all gone. The $1.5 trillion infrastructure plan that the administration is putting forward, of which $200 billion is federal money, that's not new money, that's existing money, some of it coming right out of the Corps of Engineers. So if we're looking for the devil, it's us. We did it to ourselves. I don't know how we're going to deal with all of this going forward. The fact of the matter is the money is not there. The $96 billion of projects already authorized, It's not going to happen until this Congress decides that it's actually going to find new revenue. So, you know, enough of that. You've got 6 principles in your testimony, Mr. James, some of which have profound effect on the way in which the Army Corps of Engineers will operate. I know that you don't have the detail today, but you're going to be under enormous pressure from the administration to carry out the principles in the infrastructure program, of which the 6 principles in your testimony will radically change how the Army Corps of Engineers operates, not just on the environmental side, but on the operational side. So we've got some challenges out ahead on the policy. You're not going to be able to respond today. You've been at this less than 3 months, 2 months actually, and but I just draw your attention to those 6 principles. Obviously, I want my projects. Obviously, we all do. Obviously, there's no money for any of this, or for much of it. But the 6 principles that you mentioned in your opening testimony have profound effect on all that we do. So I look forward to working with you, or perhaps against you, as those principles are enunciated and as they come into legislative reality, or at least before us. I'll let it go at that. We both have some enormous challenges out ahead of us. I look forward to working with you. Welcome. If I can provide you with any information on the Sacramento River, I look forward to that. And I am looking forward to what you've offered everybody else, that in-office opportunity to talk.
Thank you, sir, and I'll take you up on that. And, you know, I'm willing to look at those principles and get your opinion on what they would affect. I'm trying to affect efficiency and getting down to actually moving dirt. So we'll work on that together.
Given your many years on the Mississippi River and my work on the maritime, Coast Guard Maritime, we will be coordinating as well as on this committee. Look forward to working with you. We do have challenges.
Thank you, Mr. Garamendi. We're going to go to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Babin, for 5 minutes.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Assistant Secretary in General. Congratulations on your appointment, and I'm glad you're where you are. A lot needs fixing at the Corps of Engineers, and I know you have a big job ahead of you. President Trump has repeatedly said that we need to shorten the permitting process. This is a great concern to me as well, especially in my district of Southeast Texas, from Houston over to Louisiana. I've always had a great relationship with the Galveston district. I served 15 years on a river authority, the LNVA, and then also had a brother-in-law that worked for the Galveston district for about 25 years, who retired a number of years ago. But lately, we've been getting a lot of complaints about permitting. It just doesn't seem that the Galveston district is adhering to the national standards for performance results. It's my understanding that only 11 permits were approved out of more than 100 pending. I've talked to numerous constituents who were supposed to get an answer in 60 days. Almost all it's been more than 180 days. So I have a real concern about that. Hurricane Harvey was on another note, Hurricane Harvey was an unprecedented storm, but now we know there is precedent for a future one. What can I report back to my constituents about lessons learned and actions taken by the Corps to help make sure that this same disaster does not strike if we're hit again next year or 5 years from now? And also if you would address the permitting as well. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for the welcome. I have a priority on my desk of working with the general on the permitting process. Actually, in shop, in his command, he's already working on that. I've got a task force I've established, and we're going to work on it, and from a different perspective, and hope we together reach a good end for everybody. I've been familiar with it and impacted by the permitting process for years myself.
Right, I'm sure so. Okay, and then you've heard a lot of constructive criticism today, but I want to talk to you about an issue that I believe the Corps actually does get right. but it's in another sector of our government that fortunately does not. As you know, when determining benefit to cost ratios, or BCRs, the Corps of Engineers calculates an unquestionable economic value of a project that is in the energy export supply chain. This is called the Section 6009 value add. Unfortunately, as I said, not everyone in our government does the arithmetic the same way, namely the OMB. This means that for projects like my Cedar Bayou project terminal in my district in Baytown, Texas, the value you assign is 5 to 1, but OMB's is less than 2 to 1. In a discussion for another day, Congress has yielded most of its specific spending authority to the administration, and this office in particular. So unfortunately, the decision of OMB is pretty much how things will stand, and it's been several years that we're trying to get this project off the ground. Can you explain a little bit why the Corps makes these common sense calculations on Section 6009, and can I get your commitment to explain to officials at OMB why they should do the same thing?
I can explain the first. I cannot commit to trying to get OMB to do anything. Now, I have already met with OMB once. I have met with Secretary of Agriculture once, and I have meetings planned for EPA and the Interior, basically Fish and Wildlife. As far as OMB, I'm working with them, trying to get them maybe to understand better where our BC ratios are coming from and how we're prioritizing projects with the limited funding we have available. And, you know, they have the decision. They're the Office of Management and Budget, and they have had that job under every administration that I've witnessed. And so it's not a change. But I do think there's a glimmer of hope that we'll be able to explain our positions maybe more than there have been in the past.
Okay. You never addressed my storm question either, but that's okay. I'm out of time, and so I'll yield back.
I'll be glad to meet with you on it.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, gentleman from Texas. Now I'm going to go to the Honorable Acting Ranking Member, Ms. Lawrence, for 5 minutes.
I just wanted to hit the gavel. My question to Lieutenant General, with the development and maintenance of our water systems and infrastructure, the need for skilled trades has drastically increased because we will and we shall invest in our water infrastructure. Even now, more than 8,300 skilled trade job openings are across all industries in Michigan, and more than 6,200 are expected to be available each year through 2022. This creates an issue that must be included when you are planning and navigating in your job. As a co-chair of the Congressional Skilled Americans Workforce Caucus and advocate for skilled trades, I'm very concerned about the skill gap facing our country. Lieutenant General, what do you think the administration should do to increase the number of skilled trade workers, given our country's mass infrastructure needs, especially when states like Michigan will not be able to meet their labor needs?
So, ma'am, I share your concern. This goes to a much bigger question. It goes back to not just skilled trades, but really also that we're having the same thing with STEM when it comes to engineering, the capability to be able to make sure we have the capacity to be able to do this. I have not thought through how the nation should solve this issue. I stay in my lane, and I worry about making sure we've got the capability in the Corps. I'd love to be able to take it on, but I'm looking for innovative ways now of bringing people in. I have a hard time hiring people because of the challenges we have of going through the hiring process. I'd love to be able to, if I find somebody an apprentice and I can go buy on the shelf, I'd love to do direct hires so I can go down to an apprentice or a local co-op and to be able to bring them in. The average right now is over 100 days to be able to hire an employee. We just can't do, that goes back to this thing about process. How can we find better ways of being able to change some of the policies to be able to bring people on board? It is a concern, though, without a doubt.
Lieutenant General, you said something that is extremely important. staying in your lane. This issue of skilled trades have risen to a point that we are bordering on a future crisis. And we're going to have to be able to work across our lanes because the education, the employment, and actually the Corps should have an internal system to develop, recruit, and develop, and not just think that we're going to be able to pull in skilled workers. So I'm going to be pushing for that. I want to pose a question about water affordability. I represent the city of Detroit, and there is a growing issue because of the cost of infrastructure in communities with the affordability of water. I'm from Michigan, Flint, Michigan. I'm very, very sensitive about the infrastructure of water. As our systems continue to crumble, especially in our large urban areas, in Detroit, over 90,000 residents, which is 14% of the population, are not or cannot afford to pay their utility bills. This is due because in order to maintain the system, there is an increasing cost just for drinkable water. I know you keep saying, Your Honor, that you've only been in the job a short period, and I recognize that, but that must be on your agenda. You must be extremely aware and sensitive to the fact that affordability of safe drinking water must be on the agenda for the Corps. And I would like for you to comment.
Yes, ma'am, and I agree with you 100%. And that's not just in your area. That's all over the United States. We're seeing it in areas that you would think have plenty of water, and yet for fresh drinking water, that's not the case. That's not under the Corps' purview, is water supply. It's added at times, and I'm not sure that we shouldn't be looking at it as a nation, nationwide. But that's my feeling. Fresh drinking water is you know, it's our first job is to protect the people, provide for the people, and fresh drinking water is number one when you come to that.
It's a necessity for human life, and
it is.
Must be a priority.
It is.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We now go on to Mr. Mitchell for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for allowing me to participate in the hearing, sir. Unfortunately, my colleague from Illinois left. I'm well aware that the state of Illinois has a different perspective on the Brandon Road question than we do, than the rest of Great Lakes do. I'd ask the state of Illinois if they would identify the other Great Lakes states should Asian carp get into the Great Lakes, but we know that's not, they can't afford that. They have enough problems. I'd ask my colleague, but I don't think he wants that bill. So I would urge the Army Corps to continue to look at the Brandon Road, continue to look at how we implement that, because while they contend that Asian carp are down to 93% of what they were, it only takes a few to create a major crisis in the Great Lakes. And I continue to urge the Army Corps to move forward, and if need be, we'll wrestle with the state of Illinois. It'll be fun. On another project I want to ask you a question about, General, is as you both know, there's an economic evaluation report in progress for the Soo Locks. Can you tell me what the current status of that report is?
So, sir, we've been pushing hard to be able to continue to bring this to the left. Right now, I talked to the district commander. They are in the final throes of recalculating what that looks like. I'll see that in another month or so, and then it is our goal to try to get that in so that if there is a WRDA, we can certainly have that eligible for WRDA. We're using a date roughly order of magnitude around June to be able to get things into the committee, and I think that's what we would be looking at. I think there's another discussion we have to have as well on the value of Soo Locks to national security, and do we in fact have to hang Soo Locks on a benefit-cost ratio, or is that a project that has so much more value that perhaps there's another way that the committee can look at authorizing that?
Well, I would agree. When the report's done around about June, we're going to release that to the public at the same time, do you believe?
Yeah, I think so, sir. Yeah.
Okay. It's my understanding for a project to move forward, if you just look at economic value, it needs a cost-benefit ratio of 1. Is that correct? At least 1 or greater.
For me to sign a chief's report, it's a benefit ratio of 1.0 at the current interest rate, which is about 2.35, I think I use, or whatever it is.
One of the problems I understand in economic analysis is that they don't consider what they call tertiary factors. Those include people losing their jobs. The estimate, which most people agree on, is about 11 million people, Americans, will lose their jobs within the first 90 days should the poll lock go down. Back to national security, back to economic rationality. I went to school in economics and public policy. The idea that you don't consider job loss and economic impact on this country as part of evaluating the economic value of something like this, does that make any sense to you?
Sir, on all the projects we do, there's always a lot of stakeholders that want to add additional analysis in there. I think in fairness, we have a set of authorities that we normally follow on what can be included and what can't. I'm not necessarily sure whether job loss is one of those, but I think it's something we've got to be aware of, but I'm not sure we can add it into the calculus.
Well, it's my understanding that job loss as a tertiary item is not in that one-to-one economic calculus. I've had pretty extensive conversations about that, and while I understand the idea that stakeholders have a variety of positions on it, the reality is these are people working in this country. They're the people that vote for all of us here, that vote for us so we can actually provide money to the Army Corps to do what they need to do. So I think they fall in a different category than some interest group, frankly. So I could not encourage more the Army Corps. It's not just this project. As you look at other projects in the country, we need to look at the economic impact of those in terms of the impact on individuals. Will people lose their jobs if we don't do it? How many people are going to be impacted? To say that's not part of the economic analysis is, to be honest with you, a pretty astonishing thing to me, I found. What's the next step after your economic analysis, sir?
So then we'll obviously see where it competes in the budget. And if, in fact, it competes well, then we continue to drive on. So, I mean, we're very aggressive on the Sioux Lock, and I personally was there about 2 months ago. I know the Secretary's going, and it's something that we think is very, very valuable. And we can talk all day about, especially on the Department of Defense. This goes back to steel. It goes back to other things when it comes to what the Department of Defense needs in time of war to be able to make sure we have the right degree of iron ore and to be able to take care of our country.
Well, and you're right. On the national security front, it's not just a time of war. The ability to supply iron ore and various other things for the defense contractors to build what they're currently building to make this country safe is jeopardized. Can you real briefly, as I am running out of time, outline a couple of the national security concerns you see with not having a second lock?
Well, I think it really goes back to what our nation would need to be able to mobilize very, very quickly. And if you don't have that capability coming in, you're just going to have to find, as we talked earlier, you're going to have to find another way of moving iron ore around through the lock, and that's very expensive, and it takes a lot of time.
Well, that infrastructure doesn't exist right now either.
Exactly right.
At last I saw in terms of rail lines to move around the Sioux Lock was between $6 and $10 billion. And the cost to put in a new lock is estimated at what?
I'm not sure the number, sir.
Okay.
It's a large number, without a doubt. I can get it to you. It's in the book.
That's
but
right.
I'll see you afterward, and I'll tell you the number in about a half an hour.
Well, my time's expired, and I appreciate the thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. I'm going to turn to the gentleman from Illinois, Ms. Bustos.
All right, thank you, Chairman Graves and Congresswoman Esty, and thanks to the Army Corps for being here today. My congressional district covers the entire northwestern region of the state of Illinois. So the entire western border of my district and, of course, the state of Illinois is the Mississippi River, and then we have the Illinois that runs through the southern part of my district. So I just want you to understand where I'm coming from. And I know that people from throughout my congressional district would line up and talk with you about how the locks and dams have outlived their usefulness. I mean, you understand this. Our inland waterway system moves more than 600 million tons of cargo each year. But because of the outdated infrastructure, nearly half of the shippers are experiencing delays. Again, I know I'm not telling you anything you don't know. The fix-as-fail approach of the locks and dams puts our growers and our manufacturers and the navigation industry into a guessing game as to whether they're going to be able to deliver their goods on time. And Assistant Secretary James, I know that as a farmer that you understand this, and I'm really happy to have you at the Corps. I love that you have that background. Also, I know that my colleague from Illinois, Congressman Davis, brought up NESP and that both the navigation and environmental aspects of the program are critical to his district, to my district, to our state, to our region. So I do really appreciate your commitment, and also would appreciate being able to work with you, and just wanted to let you know I'm somebody who you can work with on that program. So let me get to my questions. The President's FY 2019 budget request proposed a new user fee on commercial barge owners operating on the inland waterway system. This fee would be on top of the current diesel fuel tax that was just raised in 2014. At the same time, the budget fails to spend the money, the money that users have already paid into the Inland Waterway Trust Fund. So I'm wondering what the administration's reasoning is behind imposing a new user fee while failing to reinvest the full money users have already paid to improve our locks and dam system. And Mr. James, maybe you could start with that, please.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much. Thank you for the welcome.
Yes.
The increased fee is to prepare for infrastructure in the inland waterway system over the next 10 years. Now, I know we have a balance in there right now, and I do know that the navigation industry heartily agreed to the 29 cents. I can't honestly say what they think about the additional fee. I haven't talked to them about that. But that's why we have asked to put on that additional fee, to try to build up a coffer so that when we do get the money through the regular funding process, we can move out on these antiquated locks and dams.
Okay. Lieutenant General, anything you'd like to add?
It wouldn't be my way of doing things, those trust funds, but that's the way they are.
Okay.
I think the Secretary's got it, ma'am.
Okay. Now, is there an economic analysis that you could provide that would evaluate the impact of a user fee on the commercial barge industry to help them understand, to help us understand that what that would do to the cost of goods being shipped along our rivers?
I haven't seen anything like that in writing. We will, the staff will look at that, and if I can find something, I'll sure get it to you.
Okay, that'd be helpful. We'd just like to have a deeper understanding of what that would look like, if you don't mind. With my remaining 1 minute and 20 seconds. So we have an $8.7 billion backlog of inland waterway projects. So when the President gave a speech about our locks and dams last summer on the Ohio River, I had hoped to see a plan for real investment in infrastructure. Unfortunately, there hasn't been additional federal investment in the locks and dams plan. And with no new starts included in the budget and so many of our locks and dams far past their design life, as we had just brought up, what is the administration's plan for addressing the need to upgrade our locks and dams, if you could get into that, either one of you?
Ma'am, I can't address that at this time. I guess I would say I don't know the position right now. That's basically a pretty deep policy position, and honestly, I haven't been here long enough to get into that. If I can determine that, I will get to you with it as soon as possible.
Okay, and we'd love to have a deeper conversation after you've had a chance to get settled in a little bit. And Lieutenant General, is there anything that you might be able to offer on that?
I would just say, ma'am, the most important thing we can do is, from an engineering perspective, make sure that Congress understand and the administration understand the risk if, in fact, you don't invest in infrastructure.
That's a great point. That's a great point. All right, I am out of time, and I just want to thank you both for answering my questions. I appreciate it. With that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We're going to go to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to note that my colleagues have asked a lot of damn questions today, but nobody's asked the damn question I care about. I wanted to ask about Olmsted and Lock 53. The whole series of dams works together, and so even though this project is not in my district, it matters to everybody, really. In the eastern part of the country, we had some intermittent problems with Lock 53. And so everybody's anxiously awaiting seeing Olmsted come online, at least enough to ameliorate the issues at Lock 53. Could you tell us where we are on the schedule of seeing that?
Sir, we're doing great on Olmsted. We'll be done this summer. At some point, we want to invite everybody out there. We'll have some type of a ceremony and be able to make sure that we recognize that. I think just because you brought it up, this is where if you do things in a deliberate manner with full, efficient funding, then we can get things done the right way. So this is where we had the capability, done it, did it in a period of time. I'm sure everybody would like to have gone faster. There are other locks or dams right now that we are dribbling money at, which instead of doing it in an efficient way, which could be 3 or 4 years, we're doing it over 15 or 20 years. And as a result, it just gets to be very, very inefficient and very, very expensive. But Olmsted is a success story of how to be able to effectively fund a project.
Well, we can ring the bell when it's working. I think we've had a few times in Congress, not that particular project, where we celebrated victory too early. But when it's working, I'll be glad to help cut the ribbon until it's working. Don't bother inviting me to the ribbon cutting. Mr. James, welcome on board. Congratulations on your nomination. I was looking through your history here, and I saw that you are an alumnus of University of Kentucky. Congratulations. That's not my alma mater, but we're awfully proud of it in Kentucky.
Well, we all couldn't get in there, sir.
Yeah. Some of us had to settle for MIT. I wanted to ask you about the president's initiative here, following up on Ms. Bustos's questions and concerns. And I know you've only been in the hot seat for a few weeks, but some of us were left sort of scratching our head more at what the proposal for the user fees didn't say than what it did say. I don't think that the users of the inland waterways are excited about paying a new fee after having voluntarily agreed to an increase in the fee they pay. One thing I'd like to note, the harbors and the inland waterways are similar in that the recreational folks get a free ride, if you will. But the inland waterways also have some other users, like the hydroelectric dams and many municipal water supplies who benefit from the inland waterways. So there's not a whole lot of excitement for paying more fees from the one user that does pay the fee. But one thing that I did want to ask about before I run out of time is P3s were put forward in the President's plan as a way to maybe facilitate more investment in infrastructure. But a concern that I have and a lot of folks share is who would the investors of these P3s be? Would these be Wall Street banks, sovereign funds, foreign national companies? And is it wise to let foreign countries have ownership of such a strategic and important part of our infrastructure that plays a role not just in transportation but also water supply? I'm going to ask you, Mr. James.
Well, I have a concern about those as well. My concern is that the areas of the country that don't have buyers, whoever they are, to help furnish money for projects may be left out under that scenario. Now, the President, I was very happy to see that in his proposal he has funding for rural America cut out of there as a slice, a pretty good slice of his proposed funding for infrastructure initiative. So, to answer your question directly, I don't think I can. I have no idea of the planning. That initiative has not trickled down to my level, and so I really can't answer your question.
Well, let me just close by thanking you, General Simonite, for the attention to Olmsted. Very appreciative of the action that's been taken on that, and understand that it requires funding to pay for it. And Mr. James, I look forward to working with you, and just ask that the users who are going to pay the fees be included in the discussion about any alternate ways of paying those fees. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. We can go to the gentleman from Texas, Ms. Eddie Bernice Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for holding the hearing. And let me again acknowledge and welcome our witnesses, and to say that one of the President's infrastructure legislative principles includes the federal divestiture assets. And I understand that we are seeking new and creative ways to fund infrastructure projects. However, what we don't want is to sell off our assets to simply the highest bidders, regardless of the entity's ability to efficiently and effectively manage those assets for the public good. I am from Dallas, Texas. It's the inland part of the state where we have to build and supply our own water. And I believe that the state and local governments are best equipped to understand and utilize these assets if the federal government is looking to divest itself from the responsibility. But in this context of federal divestiture, has the Corps considered a right of first refusal for state and local government entities?
On the particular projects, ma'am, no. I think the way I have read what is out there at this time is that state and local governments, plus any other entity, could get in on that plan as far as purchasing.
Well, as this consideration goes forth, I would like very much to get your commitment that you will consider first consider the impact on local communities. Because inland waterways, Texas relies heavily on its inland waterways for the movement of goods and throughout the Gulf. In fact, just this week, the Corps outlined its plan to modernize the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway at the Brazos River floodgates and the Colorado River locks. However, the President's budget request proposes some alarming changes to the Inland Waterways Trust Fund that could impact the cost of goods for shipment along the inland systems, such as the Gulf Intercoastal Waterways. Even more alarming is the President's push to privatize segments of the inland waterways systems. I'd like if you would elaborate on the rationale behind this push to privatize certain projects along these inland waterways and how it might impact existing projects, such as the Gulf Intracoastal Waterway project in Texas. It is unique that an inland city is one of the largest trade cities in the country. And so we depend a lot on transporting by waterways. We use both the ports at Houston as well as Long Beach. And we have some real concerns about the waterways and how they will be managed.
I understand and I sympathize with your concerns, but at this time I would like to visit with you on that. As I get more information, due to the fact that I haven't been here very long, and I apologize for that, but as I get the information and digest the information, get some briefing on the information, I'd like to visit with you further on this subject.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We've had great working relationships with the Corps. We want to continue that, and I appreciate your willingness to get back with me. In 2017, Hurricane Harvey brought the greatest amount of waterfall ever recorded in the lower 48 states due to a single storm in Texas. In what ways does the President's budget request help to not only meet our current water-related infrastructure needs, but also to build these projects more durably, because we know that resilience is going to be very important for the future?
So, ma'am, let me take that. I think the most important way is not necessarily in this year's budget, but it's in the supplemental, the disaster supplemental that was passed. And we got $17.4 billion from Congress to be able to invest. And there was a very specific laydown of where that money should go, but most of that money would go into the storms that were affected by Harvey, Irma, and Maria. So that's where we're really going to be able to look at the resiliency. How do we come back in? So some of that we'll have to look at studies. There's a lot of different engineering solutions, but as we continue to put that portfolio together, we'll bring it back up and make sure that everybody's informed as to where that investment's going to go.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlewoman from Texas. We're going to go to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Lieutenant General, I have a question about the, there was a backlog prevention provision in the last WARDA bill, and I assumed that that would mean that there would be deauthorizations of some sort. Is there a ongoing list? Are you working on that? Is that happening?
Yes, sir. We have a list. I've got it right here of exactly where we're trying to deauthorize. Also, some of this is where we are getting disposition to get rid of things that we don't need anymore. So we
is there a dollar amount associated with that, or an ongoing, or a dollar amount?
I don't think it's that. I have got dollar amounts for every single project. If that's what we can certainly lay this out for you, exactly where you want to ask. But I've got probably a 20-page list here of different items that are in there.
Is it growing? Or is it done?
No, I think it's, there is a dollar number. I'm looking at deauthorization list of a $1.48 billion. And I think sometimes things get added, sometimes they come out. I think it's probably continue to get smaller. But let me verify and come back with you on that.
Well, print it out before it gets smaller. Maybe we could stop the going down. But is there a provision or anything to make a report to Congress on those?
This was, it's an annual list. I think we provide it every single year. Some of this is where the local sponsor doesn't have the funds or something changes on the local side. So you authorize us to go with a project, but the conditions are not necessarily set to go. So then they just hang on the list. And several people have talked about the $95 billion. If there are places that are not good investments or we can make that list smaller, we certainly want to do that.
Right. So would you, I guess, so you don't make a periodic list and give it to the Congress?
It is my understanding we provide this list every year.
You do?
And if you need to, I will make a photocopy and get you the list in a couple days.
I'd love to have it.
Okay?
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Next, go to the gentleman from Connecticut, Ms. Esty, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Welcome, and thank you, Lieutenant General. We appreciate you being here all the way to the bitter end with those of us that are left here today. I wanted to let you know about, and we'll certainly share with your staff, John Katko, who is not able to be with us here today. He and I co-led a group of 24 Democrats and 24 Republicans called the Problem Solvers Group with a study on infrastructure. And water projects were an important part of that. And one of those pieces was about the need for us to adhere to taking dedicated funds, in this case the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, and ensuring it's spent for the purpose for which it's collected. This is important for several reasons. Number one, we actually have needs that are not being met, and our failure to meet those needs in U.S. ports is leading to a loss of business to China and to Mexico that endangers our national security by having more overland traffic, in particular coming up through Mexico, which leads in my district to issues with opioids, illegal guns, and other issues. So it has a national security component when we don't properly dredge our ports to a level that they can actually accommodate these larger ships. So it has real-world consequences, not just for the jobs, which are important in those districts, but it has national security and health consequences for Americans. So I think we need to keep that in mind. And there is a broader question of the faith and trust of the American people. You know, people are willing to pay for gas tax and other things when they see their roads getting fixed. Shippers are willing to accept these fees, but when they don't see it being put to the use for which it is collected, then that undermines the faith of the American people. and their willingness to support the projects that you know are needed and that we know are needed. So I think it is very important, and I hope you will help us be advocates for respecting what those funds are used for. And so I just want to put that out there because I think it is broader than just the issue, the important issue of us not having adequately funded. It is also this question about the trust of people from whom we collect fees. And if we don't do that, we lose our ability to fund, pretty much all infrastructure is funded on that basis. And when we underfund some areas like the Highway Trust Fund and take out of the general fund, and when we raid from the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund to put into the general fund, we are undercutting those core principles. So that is really more of a statement than any question, but I hope you know how seriously we take this, and I think there's a growing number of members on both sides of the aisle, a lot of them in this committee, that are going to be fierce about defending that and want you to know that and your assistance in doing this, which I think has broader implications for the United States. I met yesterday with the National League of Cities, and they were in Washington to meet with members of Congress, but also to launch and announce their commitment to a set of principles around resilient infrastructure. Several things that are relevant for us in this room today. Number one, their focus is on flooding. These are mayors of big and small cities, Democrats and Republicans from all over the country, and all of them are struggling with and worried about flooding. They're worried about property loss. They're worried about loss of life. And there are vigorous debates, and actually Eddie Bernice Johnson and I were bouncing back and forth between the Science Committee and this committee. We can have the debates all day long about whether there is climate change and what's causing it, but you ask any mayor who's dealing with flooding, you ask the mayor of Meriden, Connecticut, in my district, my next door city, they will say they don't care what the explanation is, they know what's happening. And it floods out the middle of their city and has done it for decades and is getting worse. So I think it's going to be important, and they called on the need for actual funding. They said it cannot be, and several of my colleagues have mentioned this, Wall Street is not going to pay to deal with flooding projects in Meriden, Connecticut. And so I can tell you, and we'll share with you the big city and small city mayors across this country who are looking to this committee, looking to the administration, and looking to the Corps to help them with dealing with these flooding problems, which are gotten worse because we haven't dealt with them, and now we have climate issues such as 50 inches of rainfall falling in Houston. The last piece to flag for you is the need to use new and resilient materials and better planning processes. This is part of what the League of Cities called for, but it is also part of our bipartisan proposal. So again, I'd like to follow up. I see my time's already expired, but you should know there's intense interest at all levels of government, bipartisan, for incorporation of new materials, better research, and better planning so that we're making better use of taxpayer dollars on all of these, and would like to work closely with you. And I see Lieutenant General, you are nodding your head vigorously because you know this is something we need to fix together. Thank you, and I have nothing to yield back.
Thank you. And let the record reflect, he was nodding his head vigorously. So.
Exactly, he was, indeed. I wasn't just saying that.
Thank you. We're going to go to the gentleman from South Carolina, who I want to thank for hosting us on a good trip over to Charleston to see what's going on with the port over there. Mr. Sanford, for 5 minutes.
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, since you bring up the port in Charleston, I'll speak on the port in Charleston. As you all well know, it's kicked off the deepening project. The chairman was kind enough to come down and give it a direct look, and I appreciate his time in doing so. As you furthermore know, it's the first project to go through the SMART planning process, and then by extension to enter into the advanced project agreement. And inasmuch as the administration has signaled its desire to move into more in the way of public-private partnerships, and inasmuch as Charleston has been rather innovative on that front, I'd, one, be curious at sort of a 30,000-foot level to get your take on what is indeed being done to enhance the odds of more projects being done as was done in Charleston. But two, there's a downside to what happened here. And if you look at, the benefit cost ratio, in essence, Charleston will be penalized for the amount of state money that has gone into the project. And so the formula, as you look at updating things, I think needs to be updated so that other ports, whether it's in Georgia, well, not Georgia, but other places other than Georgia, are not penalized in the process, because if in fairness, a local port is able to work with leaders in the state and come up with substantial funds, I don't think you want to be penalizing that process as we try and expedite more throughput to get to the $95 or $100 billion that's outstanding. Thoughts on both of those fronts?
Since I'm not really familiar with how Charleston got from where it was to where it is, since it's already being constructed, I'm going to turn that over.
Yes, sir.
So, sir, I was the division commander when we started that process, and was there 3 years. I was down there last week when we did the first dig. A great project. I think what the Corps has done, and I don't think you were at the beginning of my statement, but we have proposed a lot of different options to the administration on how to look at benefit cost ratio. There's another formula called remaining benefit cost ratio. Some of these, they've got to be justified every single year. So we're trying to propose some good, innovative solutions to try to both incentivize people to be able to step up and put money in, but at the same time, we got to be cautious, because as the Secretary said, there are some areas where you might not find someone with those funds. You don't want to necessarily penalize somebody else. So how do we find that balance? And those are some of the things the Corps is looking at recommending back to the administration.
Could you expand on that, though? I mean, in other words, because that gray area that we're talking about between, well, you don't want to penalize entities or places that wouldn't necessarily have those funds, but you do want to reward places that are innovative that do provide those funds. That gray area is ultimately what we're getting at, because, I mean, one could argue South Carolina is a relatively poor state compared to a state like, let's say, Connecticut on a per capita basis. They mustered pretty deep to come up with a couple $100 million and change number that they came up with. I mean, it could be argued, well, South Carolina is, again, on a per capita basis relative to the rest of the nation, not as well off, and therefore they didn't have the money, but they came up with it because they said it's an absolute priority. How do we better, again, reward states or entities that do so?
So I'll keep this very short, sir, but the bottom line is on the benefit cost ratio. If, in fact, somebody puts additional funds in above their share, then, in fact, should the federal government, those dollars should come off of the federal share to a degree, and then you recalculate that particular one. That's not the way the current system works, especially with not necessarily OMB, but scoring as to how is it scored as it goes through its way in the process. And this is
so indirectly, it hurts a place like Charleston currently.
These are things we're trying to recommend some solutions on how to do this in an effort to be able to solicit more incentivized funds coming in. And I think it's right, and we're in line where the administration is trying to go. As several people have said, we can't afford $95 billion of projects, so how do you find to be able to get other people to bring that money to the table and then incentivize them to do that?
And I would just close it out with, I think that Charleston, at least to a degree, shows the way there. And I would just hope that as we move forward with the project, that Charleston's not, again, penalized for what it did in terms of local equity on that front. With that, I'd yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sanford. And I want to give a shout out to Mr. Woodall for accommodating some complexity in schedule. Thank you very much. Ms. Secretary, Ms. Secretary General, as you know, this hearing is related to the 6 chief reports and the Packer that have been issued since our last WRDA bill, the WIN Act of 2016. Could you just briefly discuss any opposition to the chief's reports, the Packer that have been issued, any concerns that have been raised?
Sir, I personally signed all those, Chairman. I don't know of any specific issues in any type of a project. There's going to be different opinions, especially maybe an environmental opinion or perhaps different ways that they should have been formulated. But I think those are very, very solid projects, which are good investments to the nation. I want to continue to also let you know that between now and June, if in fact June is a potential cutoff, I expect to sign 5 more And I also expect to be able to bring 2 more packers in, and I will give you that list so you have that. In total,
Please.
for the rest of the FY, we see 11 more chiefs reports coming. So it depends on when the cutoff is, Chairman, of when you've got to be able to do that. But those, we're trying to get those as fast as we can. But I see 11 more this FY, 5 by the end of June. There's some disposition studies as well we're going to owe you, so that way we can take some things off the books.
Great, thank you. This isn't a leading question. It is appropriate to say that the non-federal sponsors in all cases of the 6 plus the packer are on board with the reports?
Exactly right, Chairman.
Great, thank you. General, we also have some projects that are moving through the process under the Section 203 authority. Could you lay out sort of how you see that evolving and how that would be incorporated into the authorization process?
So, and I'll try to do this quick. We can give you more detail. We think there's merit in the 203. A good example is the state of Florida right now wants to be able to push a 203 on an Everglades project. Initially, we went through with generic guidance to try to hit all 203s, and unfortunately, just one size doesn't fit all, and we couldn't do it that way. So now we have very specific guidance. So we want to be able to partner with whatever that entity is that's going to do the 203, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure this is a good investment for the taxpayers. So then we're coaching and mentoring to a degree that entity to be able to continue to bring that 203 back in. And we think that's working very aggressive. We're being as much as we can possibly do to be able to make sure that the integrity and the engineering is in that 203. Then the Secretary gets it, he'll make those decisions, and then we'll continue to support that.
Great, thank you. In addition to Florida, General, I want to highlight the fact that there's actually one in Louisiana.
I've heard of one there, yes, sir.
That I have particular interest in, the Home and Navigation Canal, among others, and that is one of those projects that you and I have discussed, and I've discussed it with your predecessor, and his predecessor, and his predecessor, and his predecessor, and his predecessor. Suffice to say that timeline's unacceptable. So that deepening project is, or the lack of deepening project, the lack of urgency there is resulting in us losing business, not to Texas and Mississippi, but losing business to Asia, to South Korea, to China, and other countries, having real impacts on real economic activity, real jobs, real people right here in America. And so I want to highlight that. And look, I have the chance to meet with you and Secretary James on a regular basis, and we're going to continue doing that. So rather than burning all my time, I'm going to say one more time. I think that the timeline for our water resource projects are completely unacceptable. I think the ratio of getting $1 to $2 billion in construction for a $100 billion program is ridiculous. I'm going to remind you that we've seen under the Obama administration, we've seen under the Trump administration, where your mission is being carried out by other agencies because you're being circumvented by, again, by the Obama administration, by the Trump administration, and I think that goes back to the lack of efficiency in delivering some of these projects. And most importantly, these projects aren't luxuries. These projects, in many cases, mean life or death. 1,500 of my fellow citizens died in Louisiana as a result of Hurricane Katrina. 1,500. I'm never going to forget that, never. And I'm not ever going to stop pushing y'all to deliver these projects more efficiently. With that, I'm going to yield to the gentleman from Georgia to take over the chair. I've got to run over to Secretary Zinke, but I want to thank you both very much for being here. I appreciate it. And Chairman Woodall is going to finish this thing up.
For making time for one last questioner. Secretary James, we've not gotten a chance to meet before. I'm Rob Woodall from Georgia, and I want the first words that you hear from me to be words of appreciation. It might not define our relationship forever going forward, but I want it to define our relationship on day one. Lake Lanier down in the great state of Georgia is in my district, and about the turn of the century, because you all are responsible for all the docks there on Lake Lanier. You put out guidance to say don't put your dishwashers out there on your dock, don't put the old ratty sofa out there, don't store a rotting lawnmower on your dock. I don't know what you were thinking about your good friends from Georgia there when you put out that guidance, but among the items on that list were no security cameras on your dock, no doubt with a nod towards privacy of folks who are on the lake. Well, we've had a spate of crime and vandalism, theft there on the lake, and we shared that with your local folks about a year ago today. Took them about 3 months to go through the public comment process, a visit with folks about how to make that better, and then rescind that prohibition on security cameras on docks so that our landowners, property owners could feel safe and secure. I want to thank you for that. We've heard a lot about delays here today. I want you to know when I brought that concern to you, you moved quickly, efficiently, brought everybody to the table and came out with something that we can be enthusiastic about as a community. Thank you. Thank you for that. I also want to be able to define our relationship. I know you said you hadn't had a chance to focus a lot on ports in your first 4 weeks. I can tell you everything you need to know about ports. It begins with Savannah. And all comes down from there. The Savannah Harbor Expansion Project, this committee authorized in 2014. It is the largest single container terminal in the country. It's been the fastest growing for the last decade. And in fact, our benefit cost ratio has been rising throughout this time. It was 5.5 when we started, 7.3 today. Chairman Graves has worked with us on that. Chairman Schuster has worked with us on that. Certainly you have worked with us as a core, and we're grateful for that. We fronted the project dollars out of Georgia. We put up the state match first, spent that money first as we were going through the process, $266 million. We have also decided to put in an additional $35 billion, going to bump up that required match by about 15% more, because this is so important, not just to us as a state, to us as a region, I would argue to us as a country, but for a project that's due in 2021, we're having a tough time getting the money out of the administration. $49 million was in the president's request. I just want to put that on your radar screen. We're going to have to start having that conversation about how to be better partners with you. We once had the ability to get together as a committee, decide what our priorities were, and put that money in the core budget so that you all wouldn't have to come to folks whose constitutional responsibility is to appropriate funds and get fussed at for why we're not appropriating funds fast enough. But my question to you there, now that you know that the premier port project in the country is the Port of Savannah, and it has only been allocated $49 million in the president's budget request, do you anticipate some more flexibility to dedicate dollars that are to projects that are on a short build frame with a high benefit cost ratio?
Sir, I can't answer that question right now.
Well, if you didn't have a yes, I didn't want you to answer it anyway.
Oh,
that was the only answer I was going to be excited about. So thank you for deferring. We need to find a way to take that off of our disagreement list and put it on our working together list. There is not a single constituency represented in the committee that is served by rising costs that come from delayed funding. I know we can crack that nut together, and I look forward to working with you on that. My last question also involves Lake Lanier. We, as you all know, have been working through a water resources challenge there in Metro Atlanta. I only represent 2 counties. One of them is Forsyth County, on which the lake sits, and the county water supply is brought in through an intake that belongs to the city. The county has an allocation, but the city brings in the water through a city intake. So we're having that conversation now about how to get a county intake into Lake Lanier to access a county allocation of water. dollar values of taxpayer savings vary depending on who you talk to, but because we have been involved in litigation in Lake Lanier for so long, water control manuals notwithstanding, we recognize there folks have not been in the permit handing out business. What guidance can you give to me, just because we have a little privacy here in the committee room today, about the process for getting a county intake, a right-of-way approved for a county intake for what will be a county allocation of water that the state of Georgia requests?
So, sir, I was a division commander down in Atlanta for 3 years. I know Lanier inside and out. And this is normally something that we can facilitate relatively straightforward. We have to do a special type of a permit, probably a 408, but we've streamlined those, and we have to go through that. There's clearly a cost issue to work out. I think the challenge we're going to have here goes back to the litigation and to be able to make sure we talk about what is the water supply impact on that. And you know all of the details of the different parties that are in that litigation. So if, in fact, we think we're cleared to go, green on that, then I think that's probably a relatively straightforward process. If, in fact, it goes back to now, it's not so much the pipe. The question is the water supply component of that. If, in fact, that somewhere is wrapped back into an additional draw on Lake Lanier that is not in the water control manual. It's those kind of mechanics we got to work out. I am not aware of exactly where we're at on that particular one, but Colonel Griffin is our district commander. I'm sorry, Mobile is the district the service is at. I'll make sure that DeLapp comes and talks to you where we can and walk you through that. We want to help facilitate wherever we can counties to be able to do this in a more streamlined process.
I appreciate that, General. And finally, we are wonderful stewards of water resources in our part of the world. In fact, we have $1 billion water treatment plant that sits there on Lake Lanier. We even pump water up over the Continental Divide, Mr. Secretary, in order to get it back into a basin that is in need. We don't get much credit for return flows these days, and much, of course, is a generous term that I'm using. There's no incentive today to be a good actor in that basin, and I know that's true of other places across the country. How it is we can work together to make sure we are incentivizing good behavior, no matter how many dollars we have. If we're using those dollars to maximize efficiency, I know we'll all be better served. And so I look forward to working with you in your new capacity and continuing to work with General Simonite on the return flow issue. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for my sliding in at the very last second, but my previous committee took all of 2 hours for me to get to my point in it, so I appreciate everybody's indulgence and the rest of the members of the committee here, and importantly, our witnesses too, so thank you. A very important issue in my district. I'm not sure if Mr. Garamendi was in here earlier to provide. Okay, very good. I'm sure he did. On the Sutter Butte Flood Control Agency, a project in the Yuba-Sutter area of Northern California on the Feather River, which all the issues emanate from the Oroville Dam above there, which we don't probably have to recount much of the history of that with the crisis a year ago on the spillway there. So it all ties together. What we're talking about here on that project, again, to quickly review, it's a 41-mile levee project that 36 miles out of the 41 have already been completed with basically zero cost to the federal government. What we need is a rapid new start to complete the last 5 miles. The federal government originally was obligated for up to $689 billion of cost. They've pruned the price down due to the good works at the local level and self-funding from a measure that the locals paid for on that. So we're down again to the last 5 miles. Locals are tapped out on the dollars. And so they're looking for that new start with only $49 million left to complete the final 5 miles of the 41-mile project, which again, the original cost would have been $689 million and taken longer and has been pruned down to $376 with the local work. So if the designation can be made and given and the money transferred at least just partially this year, but with a commitment to 2 years, we can be done. One and done, right, in 2019. And I know that's what the administration is looking for. That the administration in its infrastructure has been looking for that strong local participation. We've already front-loaded that with this project, stronger than I think the numbers that are even proposed in the ratios that the administration is talking about. So this would be, I think, a prime trophy moment for the administration and importantly the folks that are living near this project. Again, it's still vulnerable to floods because the levees are weak. There's a lot of material in between the levees as a result of that washout of the spillway above at Orville Dam. So this would be a great partnership with the Army Corps. As you know, the Army Corps helped pay for 20% of Orville Dam originally and owns the top 50 feet of airspace there for flood control purposes. So it's all tied together. And what I'm asking for our gentlemen here, can we receive this designation, get this new start this year, as well as have a fight for the funding to keep the progress of the work going through the December 2019 completion?
Sir, let me talk from the Corps' perspective, and I'll let the Secretary jump in. We, first of all, look at this project really as a model. You've done a great job out there, and as like you said, taken a massive amount of demand off the federal government here. We, from the Corps perspective, would think that this would compete very, very well in a FY18 work plan. The Secretary is going to be the one who's going to have to rubber stamp that up through OMB to be able to get our work plan approved. But we're looking at, I think, a total of $75 million, of which the federal share is about $50 million. And so this is something that would be able to get this done, get those 4 miles complete. And I do think it's something that the federal government is getting a pretty good deal on this. And if we can help in any way recommend to the administration to get this funded, I think this would be a pretty good investment. I'll let the Secretary jump in if need be.
Appreciate it.
I don't have anything to add to that other than the fact that it will be eligible for the 18 work plan. And with its history, probably be real eligible.
Okay, thank you. And both you understand that this is, the locals are tapped out on the property assessments and on that, and they've really carried it a long way, and you see that and understand it. I appreciate it. So besides that, with the work that's been done and paying for it so far, what other things could the locals be doing to help make the case for you, in front of you or for you, other than myself and Mr. Garamendi here in this committee and leading up to this point? What else could they be saying or doing?
I don't think we need anything, sir. The colonels that are out there that understand this, we've been briefed on this several times. If there is something, we'll certainly come back. But everything we put in the work plan, I mean, we feel very, very solid on the engineering, the requirement back to the nation, the justification of it. So I think we're where we're at, where we need. I think we've got everything we need right now.
Okay, thank you for that. Again, I hate to be the guy that pesters and such. I don't know how that works. Squeaky wheel in government. My father always told me, well, he only asked one time. You know how that goes, but I know how it works a little more in government. But I do appreciate your attention to it and you're listening to us here today. And I think this will, again, be a great success for all of us. So I look forward to inviting you out to a levee either now or in December 2019. So thank you all.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you both for not just for being here, but for answering the call of public service. It seems like in this day and age, fewer and fewer folks are willing to answer that call, but the nation depends on it. And I want to thank you both for what you do. It's been incredibly valuable for all of us on the committee. And unless any other members have a concern, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you.
How are you, sir?